Death at the Competitive Dog Show, a mystery narrated by Connor for Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mystery finds its truth in the quiet observations of Miss Marple. I'm Connor, your guide through this evening's case. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Have you ever attended a prestigious dog show where champions are crowned and bloodlines seem to matter more than the dogs themselves? Have you witnessed the careful grooming, the obsessive attention to every whisker and coat? If you have, then you might understand the world we're about to enter, a world where winning means everything, and where secrets hide beneath ribbons and trophies. Share your thoughts in the comments if you've ever seen the darker side of competitive pursuits. Now, settle in with your favourite beverage as we begin this tale of deceit, competition, and murder, most calculated. Chapter 1. The afternoon of the county show. The September afternoon was crisp with the approaching autumn, the kind of day that made the English countryside seem almost impossibly picturesque. Miss Jane Marple sat in the passenger seat of Mrs. Bantry's motor car as they made their way toward the county fairgrounds, where the prestigious annual dog show was in its final preparations. The event drew breeders and handlers from across several counties, each hoping to present the finest specimens of their chosen breeds, and to earn the coveted blue ribbons that signified championship status. Miss Marple had not initially intended to attend such an event. She preferred the quiet company of her garden and her knitting to the hustle and bustle of public gatherings. However, Mrs. Bantry had been insistent, mentioning that several of her acquaintances would be present, and more importantly, that one particular woman deserved observation. That woman was Mrs. Victoria Ashford, a breeder of considerable reputation who had dominated the show circuit for nearly 2 decades, collecting ribbons and accolades with the determined precision of someone for whom winning was not merely a preference, but an absolute necessity. Victoria Ashford had built her breeding empire on the foundation of her championship bloodlines, dogs whose pedigrees stretched back generations and whose genetic advantages supposedly made them superior specimens worthy of considerably higher prices than ordinary pups. She bred English setters primarily, though she had recently begun to venture into Irish setters and Springer spaniels, always maintaining that her bloodlines were among the finest in the world. Her kennels, located on a substantial estate some 20 miles from the village, had become something of a pilgrimage destination for wealthy buyers who paid premium prices for puppies from her renowned lines. Mrs. Bantry guided the Morris through the ornate gates that marked the entrance to the fairgrounds, and Miss Marple observed with interest how the grounds had been transformed for the occasion. Temporary structures had been erected to house the various breed rings and judging areas, while a more permanent pavilion stood ready to accommodate spectators and potential buyers alike. The scent of freshly cut grass mingled with something less pleasant, the distinctive aroma of dogs themselves mixed with shampoos and grooming products of various kinds. The parking area was crowded with vehicles, many of them belonging to the handlers and breeders who had arrived with their entries early in the morning. Miss Marple noted with interest the various types of transporters and crates, some simple and practical, others elaborate affairs with climate control and specialized compartments for grooming supplies. These vehicles seemed to her to reveal much about their owners' priorities and economic circumstances. As they made their way toward the pavilion, Mrs. Bantry pointed out various acquaintances and offered commentary on the reputations of several prominent breeders. It was clear that the dog show world possessed its own social hierarchies and rivalries, much like any other competitive arena. However, there was something about the atmosphere that struck Miss Marple as possessing a particular intensity, a sharpness of competition that seemed somehow sharper than she might have expected for an event centered on the exhibition of animals. The pavilion interior was a study in organized chaos. Exhibitors moved about with evident purpose, some leading dogs on elaborate leashes, others consulting clipboards or speaking in urgent tones to officials in official blazers. Show programs lay scattered on tables, each containing the names and numbers of all the entered dogs, along with information about their pedigrees and previous show records. Miss Marple picked one up and began to study it with her characteristic attention to detail. It was while she was reviewing the program that she became aware of a commotion near the English setter ring. A woman's voice, sharp, with authority and tinged with something that might have been anger or anxiety, cut through the ambient noise of the pavilion. The voice belonged to Mrs. Victoria Ashford, who stood beside a magnificently groomed English setter, her face flushed with what appeared to be either satisfaction or indignation. The dog, a red and white specimen of evident quality, bore the identification tag of a champion, and Miss Marple observed with interest how several other people seemed to be keeping careful watch on this particular animal and its handler. Mrs. Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's elbow, having made her way through the crowd with determined efficiency. "There she is," Dolly whispered. "Victoria Ashford. Isn't she striking?" "Well dressed, certainly," Miss Marple replied, though one might observe that her clothing, while expensive, bears the creases of recent travel and the scent of dog, rather than the careful grooming one might expect from someone of her means. Mrs. Bantry leaned closer. "You've barely laid eyes on her, and already you're making observations. What is it about her that troubles you, Jane?" Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and continued her study of Mrs. Ashford. "What troubles me, my dear Dolly, is not any single observation, but rather the entire constellation of them. A woman of her breeding and experience seems unnecessarily agitated about today's proceedings. Notice how her hands tremble slightly, and how her attention keeps returning to that particular dog, rather than focusing on the judging that is about to begin. Then there is the matter of her jewellery. Those are rather new pieces, expensively made, but worn with the discomfort of someone not yet accustomed to them." Before Mrs. Bantry could respond, a tall man in the uniform of an official show steward approached Mrs. Ashford with evident purpose. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry positioned themselves where they could observe the interaction without appearing to eavesdrop directly, though it soon became apparent that such discretion might prove difficult, given the man's raised voice. "The entry documentation for your setter appears to be in order, Mrs. Ashford," the steward announced, "though I must confess that several questions have been raised regarding the authenticity of the pedigree certification." "Absolute nonsense," Mrs. Ashford replied sharply. "Those papers are entirely legitimate. Every generation of that dog's ancestry has been registered with the proper authorities." The steward's expression suggested considerable scepticism, but before he could respond further, another figure emerged from the crowd. This man was older, with the weathered features of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, and he wore the expression of barely controlled fury that came from someone attempting to maintain professional composure under considerable strain. Dr. James Hartley was the veterinary official responsible for inspecting the show entries and verifying that the documentation met all appropriate standards. He had held this position for nearly 15 years, and had developed a reputation for being both thorough and fair in his assessment of contested claims. However, Miss Marple observed, his usual professionalism seemed to have given way to something more personal and more dangerous. "Mrs. Ashford," Dr. Hartley said quietly, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he was speaking through considerable effort at self-control. "I have concerns that require resolution before your entry can be permitted to compete. Your setter's pedigree documentation does not match the registration records I received from the breed registry this morning. Specifically, the sire listed in your papers does not correspond to the individual registered in the official stud book." Mrs. Ashford's face had gone pale, though she attempted to maintain her composure. "There is clearly some clerical error," she responded, her voice lacking its earlier confidence. "These matters are handled by my staff. I cannot be personally responsible for every detail of administrative work." "Cannot or will not," Dr. Hartley replied, his voice rising slightly despite his obvious effort to maintain control. "I have been attempting to bring these matters to proper attention for months, Mrs. Ashford. You have been selling puppies with fraudulent pedigrees, puppies from dogs with genetic disorders that you knew about but chose to conceal." The accusation hung in the air like a physical blow, and Miss Marple observed how the crowd around them seemed to pause, as though the entire pavilion had suddenly become attentive to this confrontation. Mrs. Ashford looked about as if seeking some avenue of escape, or perhaps some ally who might come to her defence. However, most of those who had been watching the scene seemed inclined to move away rather than involve themselves in what was clearly a matter of considerable conflict. "You have no proof of any such allegations," Mrs. Ashford said coldly, attempting to recover some of her earlier authority. "And I intend to report your harassment to the show committee." Dr. Hartley seemed about to respond when Mrs. Bantry tugged gently at Miss Marple's sleeve, suggesting that they retreat to a less conspicuous location. As they moved away, Miss Marple reflected on what she had witnessed. The confrontation between the veterinarian and the breeder suggested that considerable anger and grievance lay beneath the surface of this event, carefully concealed but explosive when provoked. Chapter 2. The Question of the Perfect Pedigree. Over the course of the next several hours, the dog show proceeded according to established tradition, with judges examining the entered dogs, comparing them against breed standards, and offering their assessments of which animals best represented the ideal characteristics of their respective breeds. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry observed from the spectator areas, though Miss Marple found herself paying considerably more attention to the interactions between the various participants than to the actual judging process. Mrs. Ashford's setter, despite the questions that had been raised regarding its pedigree, was permitted to compete in its assigned class. However, Miss Marple noted that Dr. Hartley remained present throughout the proceedings, watching with an intensity that suggested he was more interested in observing Mrs. Ashford than in the actual performance of the dogs. The tension between them seemed to have attracted notice from others as well. Several breeders with whom Miss Marple spoke mentioned that there had been considerable controversy regarding Mrs. Ashford's practices, though most seemed reluctant to discuss the matter in any detail. It was during the lunch interval that Mrs. Bantry encountered an old acquaintance, a woman named Margaret Winters, who had, years ago, purchased one of Mrs. Ashford's prized puppies. Miss Marple observed Mrs. Winters's face as the two women embraced in greeting, noting the particular tightness around the eyes and the slight tremor in her hands that suggested emotional distress of some kind. "Dolly," Margaret said warmly, though her smile seemed forced. "What a pleasure to see you. I had no idea you would be attending the show." "We're here rather spontaneously," Mrs. Bantry replied. "Jane insisted we come, and Jane's instincts about these matters are usually quite sound." Margaret glanced at Miss Marple with evident curiosity, and Mrs. Bantry introduced them with her usual efficiency. "Margaret has had considerable experience with dogs of the highest quality," Dolly explained, having purchased several champion specimens over the years. Miss Marple noted the careful way Margaret responded to this introduction, her smile becoming, if anything, even more strained. "Yes. Well, I have had certain experiences with superior breeding stock," she said carefully. "Some more pleasant than others, I'm afraid." She paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to continue, then added with sudden directness, "You should know that I purchased a setter puppy from Mrs. Ashford 5 years ago for an enormous sum. That animal died of hip dysplasia before it reached maturity. When I inquired about the circumstances, Mrs. Ashford informed me that such conditions were purely matters of chance, and that she could take no responsibility for what she referred to as environmental factors." Mrs. Bantry looked troubled by this information, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of interest that accompanied revelations of deliberate deception. Did Mrs. Ashford's documentation regarding the puppy's ancestry mention any history of this condition in the breed line? Miss Marple inquired gently. Margaret laughed, though there was little humour in the sound. The documentation was, in retrospect, rather vague about such matters. Only later did I discover, through quite a bit of research and conversation with other breeders, that Mrs. Ashford's dogs have a documented history of genetic problems. Several other buyers have had similar experiences to my own, though most have been reluctant to pursue legal action, either out of embarrassment or because they lacked the resources to challenge someone of Mrs. Ashford's standing. This conversation proved illuminating to Miss Marple, suggesting as it did that Dr. Hartley's accusations were grounded in documented fact rather than simple professional disagreement. Mrs. Ashford, it appeared, had been conducting a deliberate deception of considerable scope, selling dogs of questionable genetic quality while using fraudulent pedigree documentation to justify the premium prices she charged. The victims of her scheme, lacking expertise and perhaps reluctant to publicly acknowledge that they had been deceived, had largely suffered in silence. As the afternoon progressed toward the final judging rings, Miss Marple found her attention returning repeatedly to Mrs. Ashford, who seemed to have regained much of her earlier composure despite the confrontation with Dr. Hartley. The setter was performing well in its class, responding to its handler's commands and presenting itself with the confidence of a well-trained show dog. The judge examined the animal with careful attention, running his hands over its coat, checking its teeth and structure with the methodical approach of someone familiar with breed standards. It was during this examination that Miss Marple observed something that caused her to lean forward with increased attention. The dog's coat, a magnificent red and white that gleamed under the pavilion lights, seemed to possess an unusual quality. The surface appeared almost unnaturally glossy, and when the judge's hands touched it, the animal seemed to react with slight discomfort, pulling away ever so slightly. Most spectators would likely not have noticed such a minor response, but Miss Marple had spent enough time observing animals to recognise that something about the dog's reaction suggested more than simple nervousness. Mrs. Bantry noticed Miss Marple's sudden interest. "What is it, Jane?" she whispered. "Is something wrong with the dog?" "Nothing wrong with the dog itself," Miss Marple replied quietly. "However, I would suggest that someone has taken considerable effort with that animal's grooming. The coat appears to have been treated with something beyond ordinary shampoo, something that causes the dog discomfort when touched." Dr. Hartley, Miss Marple noted, had also observed this phenomenon. He was watching Mrs. Ashford with an expression that suggested he had noticed the same irregularity. The final moments before the judge was to announce the winners were characterized by a strange tension that seemed to permeate the pavilion. Mrs. Ashford stood near her dog with what appeared to be absolute confidence, yet her hand movements suggested an underlying anxiety that she was attempting to conceal. Dr. Hartley had moved to a position closer to the judging ring, his professional responsibilities providing him with legitimate access to observe the proceedings in detail. Chapter 3. The Ribbon and the Rage. The judge's decision, when announced, awarded first place in the English Setter Championship class to Mrs. Ashford's dog. A ripple of what might have been surprise or possibly dissatisfaction moved through the spectators, though few seemed willing to openly question the judge's assessment. Mrs. Ashford accepted the ribbon with a smile that seemed triumphant, and she bent to adjust her dog's lead in preparation for the victory lap around the ring. However, it was at this exact moment that Dr. Hartley stepped forward, his expression having moved beyond professional concern into something that appeared to be genuine alarm. "Judge," he announced loudly, "I must request that this dog be removed from the ring immediately for a veterinary examination. There is evidence to suggest that the animal has been treated with a substance that may be harmful to its health." The judge, startled by this interruption, looked toward Mrs. Ashford for explanation. Mrs. Ashford's face had flushed with what appeared to be either anger or fear, perhaps both. "This is absolutely absurd," she declared. "My dog is in perfect health. Dr. Hartley's determination to sabotage my success has become ridiculous. I will not have my champion subjected to some frivolous examination based on nothing but professional jealousy." Her voice had risen to a level that attracted immediate attention from show officials, who began moving toward the situation with evident concern. Dr. Hartley stepped closer to Mrs. Ashford, his voice dropping to a level that suggested he was speaking to her alone, though several nearby observers could still hear his words. "This dog's coat has been treated with an allergen, Mrs. Ashford, a substance designed specifically to cause a reaction in anyone handling it. Only you would know precisely what it is." The accusation hung in the air with terrible clarity, and in that moment Miss Marple understood something fundamental about the situation. Dr. Hartley was not simply angry about fraudulent pedigrees, or even the sale of genetically compromised animals. He was suggesting that Mrs. Ashford had deliberately tampered with her own show dog in order to create some circumstance that she had anticipated or planned for. Before this implication could be fully explored, the show director stepped into the situation, his manner combining concern with the determination of someone accustomed to managing difficult circumstances. "I'm afraid," he announced, "that we shall need to conduct the examination that Dr. Hartley has requested. This is standard procedure whenever concerns are raised about an animal's condition. The examination will cause no harm and will serve to definitively settle this matter." Mrs. Ashford appeared on the verge of refusing, her jaw tightening and her eyes flashing with anger. However, she seemed to recognize that any further obstruction would only deepen the suspicion and controversy surrounding her entry. She turned to her handler, a young woman who had been preparing to lead the dog for its victory lap, and gestured sharply. "Do what must be done," she commanded, "though I warn you that I shall be consulting my legal representatives regarding this outrageous treatment." Dr. Hartley led the dog away from the ring area to a temporary examination area that had been established for just such contingencies. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, along with numerous other spectators, followed at a discreet distance. The veterinary examination was conducted with professional care, and Dr. Hartley's initial assessment seemed to be confirmed. The dog's coat did indeed appear to have been treated with some sort of substance that produced a mild allergic reaction in those who touched it. However, the substance itself proved difficult to identify with certainty without chemical analysis. Dr. Hartley carefully collected samples of the dog's coat, placing them into sterile containers for later laboratory examination. His expression throughout this process suggested a grim satisfaction, as though confirmation of his suspicions had vindicated concerns that he had been pursuing for some time. Mrs. Ashford, observing from a careful distance maintained by show officials, seemed to grow increasingly agitated as the examination progressed. Once the examination was complete, the dog was permitted to return to Mrs. Ashford's care, though the official announcement regarding the placement was postponed, pending the results of the chemical analysis. The remainder of the afternoon's proceedings continued, though the atmosphere in the pavilion had shifted markedly. What had been an event focused on the celebration of championship animals had become instead a gathering coloured by controversy and suspicion. It was as the day was drawing toward its close, the September sun beginning its descent toward the horizon, that the final and most tragic event occurred. Mrs. Ashford had been preparing to depart from the grounds, her vehicle having been brought around to the main exit to facilitate her departure. The dog was being loaded into its specialised crate when Mrs. Ashford bent down to adjust the animal's positioning, her bare hands making contact with the coat that had been treated with the mysterious allergen. What happened in the moments that followed was both sudden and devastating. Mrs. Ashford straightened abruptly, her hand going to her throat. Her face, which had been flushed with anger moments before, went pale with alarming speed. Those nearby heard her gasp for breath, a terrible sound that suggested her throat was closing, that she was experiencing an anaphylactic reaction of considerable severity. A nearby paramedic, fortunately present at the showgrounds as a matter of standard protocol, rushed to her aid, along with Dr. Hartley, who immediately began to administer emergency assistance. An epinephrine injection was administered with admirable speed, but despite these efforts, Mrs. Victoria Ashford collapsed before reaching the waiting ambulance. By the time she was transported to the hospital some 15 miles away, she was already dead, her anaphylactic shock having progressed beyond the point at which emergency intervention could restore her to life. The dog show, in that instant, transformed from a celebration into a crime scene. Miss Marple, who had observed the entire sequence of events with the careful attention that had become her habit, felt the familiar coldness that accompanied the encounter with violent death settle over her consciousness. What had appeared to be a matter of professional rivalry and fraudulent business practices had suddenly and terribly escalated into something far more grave. Someone, it now appeared, had not merely used the allergen as a form of accusation or protest. Someone had anticipated Mrs. Ashford's reaction and had deliberately created the circumstances that would trigger it. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Initial Assessment. The arrival of Inspector Graham, the county police detective, proceeded with the organised efficiency that Miss Marple had observed on previous occasions when the forces of law and order descended upon a situation requiring their attention. The dog show grounds, transformed from a place of competition into a scene of official investigation, took on an entirely different character as police constables established a perimeter and began the systematic process of documenting the circumstances of Mrs. Ashford's death. Inspector Graham was a man of middle years, with the careful demeanour and analytical approach that suggested considerable experience in matters of criminal investigation. He established his temporary headquarters in the main pavilion office and began the methodical process of conducting interviews with those who had been present at the critical moment when Mrs. Ashford had collapsed. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry were among those requested to provide statements regarding what they had observed. They were shown into the temporary office, where Inspector Graham sat behind a desk that had been hastily cleared of dog show materials to accommodate the official business that now took precedence. Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, the inspector acknowledged, reviewing a preliminary list of those interviewed. You were both present at the time of the incident. I understand you have some acquaintance with the circumstances of this event. Indeed, Inspector, Miss Marple replied, settling herself into the offered chair with the careful deliberation that characterized her movements. Though I confess that what we observed raises considerably more questions than it provides answers. Inspector Graham leaned forward with evident interest. Questions, Miss Marple? What sort of questions? She carefully explained what she had observed regarding Mrs. Ashford's coat treatment, the confrontation with Dr. Hartley regarding pedigree fraud, and perhaps most significantly, the unusual nature of Mrs. Ashford's anaphylactic reaction. Most people, Miss Marple noted, would not experience a fatal allergic reaction to a contact allergen applied to an animal's coat. Such a reaction would typically manifest as localized itching or irritation rather than anaphylaxis. The inspector made careful notes of these observations, and it was clear from his expression that Miss Marple's analysis had struck him as significant. You're suggesting, then, that the allergen itself may not have been the source of the fatal reaction. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed. I suspect that Mrs. Ashford possessed an underlying vulnerability of which others were aware, and that someone had deliberately calculated that her exposure to this particular substance, combined with whatever her underlying allergy might be, would produce the fatal outcome that occurred. This assessment proved to be sufficiently intriguing that Inspector Graham requested that Miss Marple remain available for further consultation as the investigation proceeded. He then turned his attention to Dr. Hartley, whom he interviewed with particular intensity given the veterinarian's obvious conflict with the deceased. However, it was during the more general interviews that a curious detail emerged. Several show attendees mentioned that they had observed Dr. Hartley in what appeared to be a heated private conversation with Mrs. Ashford approximately 1 hour before her collapse. The conversation had taken place in a relatively isolated area near the grooming stations, and while the specific words exchanged could not be heard by witnesses, both participants had appeared genuinely angry. As evening settled over the grounds and the preliminary interviews continued, Inspector Graham called for a meeting with the primary persons of interest in the case. These included Dr. Hartley, himself, Mrs. Ashford's handler, a woman named Rachel Stevens, and several of the other breeders who had been present at the show and who had experienced difficulties with Mrs. Ashford's practices. Inspector Graham, it became apparent, was pursuing the straightforward theory that Dr. Hartley, motivated by anger over the fraudulent pedigree practices and possibly by some form of professional jealousy, had deliberately treated Mrs. Ashford's dog with an allergen in order to create a public scandal. The fact that this action had resulted in Mrs. Ashford's death was, in the inspector's initial assessment, a consequence that perhaps had not been anticipated, but which certainly served to eliminate the source of the veterinarian's professional frustration. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly sceptical of this simple narrative. Dr. Hartley's anger seemed to be rooted in genuine concern for the welfare of animals and the integrity of breeding practices rather than in personal ambition or professional rivalry. Additionally, the specific nature of Mrs. Ashford's fatal reaction suggested a level of knowledge and premeditation that seemed inconsistent with a spontaneous act of revenge. Chapter 5. The Allergy That Became a Weapon. It was not until late evening, after most of the show attendees had been released to depart from the grounds, that Miss Marple discovered the crucial evidence that would fundamentally shift the investigation's direction. She had remained at the showgrounds with Mrs. Bantry, observing the police procedures and contemplating the various contradictions in the case that troubled her. It was while examining the area near Mrs. Ashford's grooming station, ostensibly to retrieve Mrs. Bantry's forgotten spectacles, that Miss Marple observed something that had escaped the notice of the official investigators. In a waste bin beneath the grooming table, carefully concealed beneath soiled towels and discarded materials, lay a small glass vial, containing a clear liquid. The label on the vial, barely visible beneath a layer of grime, read "Specialized Allergen Treatment Formula number 7. Miss Marple carefully retrieved the vial without disturbing the surrounding waste materials, and she made her way to Inspector Graham's temporary office to present this discovery. The inspector examined the vial with evident surprise, and he immediately ordered that it be submitted for chemical analysis to determine its precise contents. While waiting for these results, Miss Marple ventured a theory that caused the inspector considerable surprise. The substance in this vial, she suggested carefully, is likely not an ordinary allergen at all. I suspect it contains a concentrated form of whatever substance Mrs. Ashford herself was allergic to, combined perhaps with something designed to enhance absorption through the skin. Someone prepared this treatment with considerable care and expertise, suggesting knowledge of both chemistry and Mrs. Ashford's personal medical vulnerability. Inspector Graham's expression had shifted from confidence in the straightforward theory he had initially pursued towards something more uncertain and thoughtful. You're suggesting that someone deliberately created a substance specifically designed to kill Mrs. Ashford? Precisely, Inspector, though I would further suggest that this someone knew with considerable certainty what Mrs. Ashford's allergic sensitivity was, understood the dosage required to produce fatal anaphylaxis, and had access to the specialized knowledge necessary to create such a substance. The inspector's next move was to request a complete medical history of Mrs. Ashford from her personal physician. The results, when they arrived the following morning, proved to be illuminating. Mrs. Ashford had a well-documented severe allergy to certain insecticides, a condition that had developed following an incident years earlier when she had been exposed to agricultural chemicals. Her physician's notes indicated that she carried an epinephrine auto-injector at all times, and that she had explicitly cautioned others regarding her vulnerability to certain chemical compounds. Inspector Graham's investigative focus now began to shift toward determining who among Mrs. Ashford's acquaintances possessed both the knowledge and the motive to create and apply such a lethal substance. The list of candidates proved to be considerably longer than anyone had initially anticipated. It was while reviewing witness statements and interview notes that an interesting detail emerged. Rachel Stevens, Mrs. Ashford's handler, had apparently trained in chemistry before transitioning into the dog show world. She had worked for several years in a pharmaceutical supply company before accepting her position with Mrs. Ashford. Furthermore, several witnesses mentioned that Rachel and Mrs. Ashford had engaged in what appeared to be a serious disagreement approximately 3 weeks prior to the show, though the nature of this disagreement remained unclear. When interviewed regarding this relationship, Rachel admitted with considerable reluctance that her disagreement with Mrs. Ashford had concerned payment for services and various other professional matters. However, she denied any knowledge of the allergen substance or any intent to harm her employer. Inspector Graham, observing Rachel's demeanour, found her protestations of innocence somewhat unconvincing, yet without concrete evidence linking her directly to the preparation or application of the lethal substance, he could not pursue formal charges. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple requested a private meeting with the inspector, during which she presented an observation that fundamentally altered the investigation's trajectory. The timing of Mrs. Ashford's fatal reaction, she explained, is perhaps the most revealing detail in this entire case. Mrs. Ashford did not die immediately upon exposure to the allergen. Instead, she first touched the dog's coat, then appeared to continue preparing it for loading into her vehicle, and only then experienced the anaphylactic reaction. This suggests that the substance required a certain period to be absorbed through the skin, or perhaps that it required a second exposure or some other triggering mechanism to achieve its lethal effect. Chapter 6. The Veterinarian's Secret Burden. The investigation into Dr. James Hartley's movements and circumstances during the critical hours before Mrs. Ashford's death proceeded with considerable intensity. Inspector Graham, while still reluctant to abandon his initial theory regarding Rachel Stevens's potential culpability, found himself increasingly drawn to the conclusion that the veterinarian's role in the case was considerably more complex than his initial anger and professional accusations had suggested. It was during a detailed search of Dr. Hartley's veterinary clinic that evidence emerged suggesting a disturbing pattern of events extending far beyond the single day of the dog show. Medical records were discovered indicating that Dr. Hartley had been treating animals from several of Mrs. Ashford's breeding stock, and that these treatments had revealed genetic defects and health conditions that Mrs. Ashford had known about, but had deliberately concealed when selling puppies to unsuspecting buyers. More significantly, correspondence was found between Dr. Hartley and various breed registry authorities in which the veterinarian had attempted to document and report Mrs. Ashford's fraudulent practices. However, these reports had apparently been met with bureaucratic obstruction and apparent apathy. The breed registries, it seemed, were reluctant to formally accuse someone of Mrs. Ashford's standing without absolutely definitive proof, and Mrs. Ashford's careful documentation and carefully constructed deceptions had made such definitive proof difficult to obtain. Dr. Hartley's frustration, documented in his private notes and correspondence, had grown increasingly acute over a period of several months. He had written about his growing concern that the only effective response to Mrs. Ashford's fraud would be public exposure and professional destruction, and that he was prepared to pursue such exposure regardless of the personal professional consequences it might entail. However, when directly confronted by Inspector Graham regarding the possibility that he had prepared the allergen substance used to contaminate Mrs. Ashford's show dog, Dr. Hartley's response was one of genuine shock and denial. The accusation seemed to genuinely disturb him, and he vehemently denied any involvement in Mrs. Ashford's death. "I wanted her exposed and destroyed professionally," he admitted. "I wanted the fraud she had perpetrated to be revealed, so that her victims might seek appropriate recompense, and so that she could be prevented from continuing to breed inferior and genetically compromised animals. But I did not kill her. Whatever methods I employed to expose her fraud, they would never have extended to murder." Miss Marple, upon learning of Dr. Hartley's denials and his documented frustration with the breed registry's apathy regarding his reports, found herself considering whether the veterinarian might indeed be telling the truth. The level of premeditation and chemical sophistication required to create the lethal substance suggested someone with considerably more specialized knowledge than Dr. Hartley possessed. While his knowledge of animal medicine was certainly extensive, creating a compound specifically designed to deliver a lethal dose of insecticide through contact absorption required pharmaceutical expertise of a different sort entirely. It was this consideration that led Miss Marple to an interesting observation regarding Rachel Stevens. The handler, it was discovered upon more detailed investigation, had maintained contact with several employees of the pharmaceutical company where she had previously worked. She had even been observed visiting the company's facility approximately 2 weeks before the dog show, ostensibly to visit former colleagues, but potentially to access the equipment and materials necessary to create the specialized allergen compound. However, Rachel vehemently denied having accessed any such materials or having created any substance intended to harm Mrs. Ashford. Under questioning, she provided an explanation for her pharmaceutical company visit that was corroborated by several witnesses. She had, she explained, been attempting to obtain information regarding proper chemical handling and storage procedures for a personal project involving the development of specialized grooming products. Several members of the pharmaceutical company staff confirmed that Rachel had indeed inquired about such matters, though they expressed uncertainty regarding her specific purposes. Inspector Graham found himself increasingly frustrated by the case's complexities and the apparent lack of conclusive evidence pointing definitively to any single suspect. It was at this point that he formally requested Miss Marple's more detailed involvement in the investigation, recognizing that her particular analytical approach to seemingly disparate details had often proven to be of considerable value in reaching conclusions that more straightforward investigative procedures might overlook. Chapter 7. The Puppies That Died Too Young. As Miss Marple's involvement in the investigation deepened, she began a systematic examination of Mrs. Ashford's breeding records and the circumstances surrounding her various business transactions. This research proved to be considerably more revealing than the official police investigation had yet uncovered, for it provided documentation of a deliberate pattern of deception extending back several years. Mrs. Ashford had kept meticulous records of her breeding activities, noting pedigrees, breeding dates, and details regarding the puppies produced by her various breeding stock. However, these records also contained numerous notations regarding genetic defects, inherited health conditions, and veterinary treatments that Mrs. Ashford had apparently documented for her own purposes, while carefully omitting from the pedigree certificates she provided to purchasing clients. Miss Marple interviewed several individuals who had purchased puppies from Mrs. Ashford, collecting stories of animals that had died prematurely, suffered from hip dysplasia, exhibited behavioral abnormalities, or experienced various other health conditions that their owners had been unable to explain given the supposedly pristine genetic backgrounds documented in their pedigrees. The financial impact on these individuals had been considerable, as the prices charged for puppies from Mrs. Ashford's supposedly superior bloodlines had been substantially higher than for comparable animals from reputable breeders. One particularly compelling case involved a man named Thomas Wells, who had purchased a setter puppy from Mrs. Ashford for a sum of £2,500, representing what he had been assured would be an investment in a future champion show dog. The puppy had, instead, developed elbow dysplasia within its first year, and had proven unsuitable for show purposes. When Mr. Wells had attempted to obtain recompense or even a partial refund, Mrs. Ashford had refused to acknowledge any responsibility, suggesting that Mr. Wells's care of the animal had been inadequate. This particular case had profoundly affected Dr. Hartley, who had personally examined the puppy and had been able to document that the genetic defect had been present from birth, inherent in the breeding stock rather than resulting from improper care. Dr. Hartley's attempts to provide Mr. Wells with documentation of the genetic origin of the condition had been met with indifference by the breed registry authorities, who seemed reluctant to involve themselves in what they characterized as a private dispute between a breeder and a purchaser. As Miss Marple compiled these various cases into a comprehensive documentation of Mrs. Ashford's systematic fraud, she began to develop a more complete picture of the financial impact her deceptions had created. The total amount extracted from unsuspecting buyers through the sale of genetically compromised animals represented an enormous sum, certainly exceeding £100,000 when all transactions were considered. More significantly, Miss Marple began to recognize a pattern in the individuals who had suffered most severely from Mrs. Ashford's deceptions. Several of them had, upon discovering the genetic defects in the animals they had purchased, experienced emotional and financial hardship of considerable proportions. One woman had apparently experienced a nervous breakdown following the discovery that she had spent her life savings on an animal that proved to be of substantially inferior quality to what she had believed she was purchasing. It was during the course of these interviews that Miss Marple encountered a detail that seemed initially insignificant, but which her analytical mind recognized as potentially crucial. Several of Mrs. Ashford's dissatisfied customers had apparently sought advice from a legal consultant regarding the possibility of pursuing civil action against the breeder. That legal consultant was a man named Stephen Vane, a solicitor who practiced in the county town and who had become increasingly interested in the prospect of pursuing a class action lawsuit against Mrs. Ashford on behalf of her various victims. Mr. Vane, when interviewed by Miss Marple, provided considerable documentation regarding his investigation into Mrs. Ashford's practices and his assessment of the legal basis for a major lawsuit. The potential damages, he explained, could be substantial, particularly if he could establish that Mrs. Ashford had engaged in deliberate fraud rather than simple negligence or misrepresentation. However, Mr. Vane's pursuit of this legal action had apparently created a significant obstacle. Mrs. Ashford, upon learning of the prospective lawsuit, had engaged a prominent defense attorney and had begun a systematic campaign of legal obstruction. She had filed counterclaims, challenged the standing of various plaintiffs, and employed numerous other legal tactics designed to make the prospective lawsuit extremely expensive and prolonged to pursue. Chapter 8. The Chemist's Precise Calculations. It was while examining financial records associated with the prospective lawsuit that Miss Marple made a discovery that fundamentally altered her understanding of who had the strongest motive to eliminate Mrs. Ashford. One of the individuals who had apparently been preparing to participate in Stephen Vane's class action lawsuit was a woman named Patricia Holloway, who had purchased a puppy from Mrs. Ashford approximately 5 years prior to the dog show. The puppy, a seemingly healthy female of supposed champion breeding stock, had been purchased for the substantial sum of £3,000 as a breeding prospect. Ms. Holloway had intended to use the animal to establish her own breeding line and had already invested considerable additional funds in housing, veterinary care, and show preparation. However, the puppy had developed serious genetic problems approximately 1 year after purchase, rendering it unsuitable for breeding purposes. What distinguished Ms. Holloway's case from the other defrauded customers was her professional background. Ms. Holloway had trained as a pharmaceutical chemist and had worked for several years in drug development before transitioning into full-time involvement with dog breeding. Her chemical expertise, combined with her personal financial loss and her apparent emotional devastation at having been defrauded, suggested a level of capability and motive that placed her high on the list of individuals capable of creating the lethal allergen substance used to poison Mrs. Ashford. Inspector Graham, upon learning of Ms. Holloway's background and her connection to the prospective lawsuit, immediately arranged for her questioning. However, Ms. Holloway's responses to the inspector's inquiries were evasive and defensive. She acknowledged her pharmaceutical training and her involvement in the prospective class action lawsuit. She also acknowledged the emotional and financial impact of her experience with Mrs. Ashford's fraud. However, she vehemently denied any involvement in Mrs. Ashford's death. What troubled Miss Marple about Ms. Holloway's denials was not their content, but rather their manner. The woman seemed to be concealing something beyond mere involvement in Mrs. Ashford's death. Her responses suggested layers of deception and withholding, as though she possessed information that she was unwilling to share with the authorities. It was therefore with considerable determination that Miss Marple arranged a private meeting with Ms. Holloway, at which she approached the matter with considerably more sympathy and understanding than Inspector Graham's formal questioning had demonstrated. Miss Marple explained that she was not interested in Ms. Holloway's legal culpability, but rather in understanding the complete truth regarding Mrs. Ashford's death and the circumstances that had led to it. Under the weight of Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning, Ms. Holloway eventually broke, her carefully maintained facade of denial giving way to emotional confession. She had, she admitted, been present at the dog show on the day of Mrs. Ashford's death. She had furthermore made contact with the person who had created the lethal allergen substance, and had, in fact, been the individual who had applied it to Mrs. Ashford's show dog. However, Ms. Holloway insisted with considerable emotion that she had not acted alone, and that she had not, in fact, intended for Mrs. Ashford to die. The substance, she explained, had been created by an individual she had approached through her pharmaceutical company connections, a chemist who had himself experienced significant personal loss due to Mrs. Ashford's fraud. This chemist, whose name was Dr. Richard Summers, had been approached by Ms. Holloway with a request for a substance that would create a dramatic public scandal, exposing Mrs. Ashford's fraud and humiliating her professionally. Dr. Summers, she insisted, had been told that the substance was intended to cause a minor allergic reaction, sufficient to create embarrassment and to prompt official investigation into Mrs. Ashford's practices, but not intended to cause serious harm. Ms. Holloway believed that Dr. Summers had created a mild allergen compound based on what she perceived to be common allergic reactions to various substances. She had had no knowledge that the substance would produce fatal anaphylaxis when introduced to an individual with Mrs. Ashford's specific chemical sensitivity. Chapter 9. The Confession in Pieces. The arrest of Patricia Holloway and the subsequent search of her residence produced evidence that corroborated much of her confession, while simultaneously raising new questions about the circumstances of Mrs. Ashford's death. Among the materials discovered in Ms. Holloway's home were correspondence with Dr. Richard Summers, detailed notes regarding the planning of the allergen application, and various financial records indicating payments made to Dr. Summers for his chemical work. Inspector Graham, upon reviewing these materials, arranged for the immediate apprehension of Dr. Summers for questioning. The chemist, when brought in for formal interview, initially maintained denials consistent with those that Ms. Holloway had offered. However, Inspector Graham's confrontation with the evidence eventually prompted a partial confession from the chemist. Dr. Summers acknowledged that he had created a compound based on what he understood to be Ms. Holloway's specifications. However, he insisted that the substance he had formulated was intended to produce only a mild allergic reaction, nothing more serious. He provided documentation indicating that his calculations had been based on standard allergic response thresholds, and that he had deliberately created a formula that he believed would be uncomfortable but not dangerous. What troubled Miss Marple about this explanation was not Dr. Summers's claim that he had intended to create only a mild allergen, but rather the implications of that claim. If Dr. Summers had genuinely intended to create a non-lethal substance, then it was highly unlikely that the formula he had produced would have been specifically tailored to Mrs. Ashford's particular insecticide allergy. The creation of such a precisely calculated compound suggested a level of intentionality that extended beyond Dr. Summers's protestations of having merely created a mild irritant. Miss Marple requested a meeting with Inspector Graham, during which she presented this analysis. "I submit," she said carefully, "that Dr. Summers has provided a partially truthful confession designed to minimize his personal culpability while deflecting primary responsibility toward Ms. Holloway. However, I suspect that the truth is considerably more complex. I suspect that Dr. Summers obtained information regarding Mrs. Ashford's specific allergic sensitivity and deliberately created a substance calculated to produce fatal anaphylaxis in her." Inspector Graham's response suggested that he had reached a similar conclusion, though he appreciated Miss Marple's articulation of the logical basis for it. "The question," the inspector noted, "is what prompted Dr. Summers to shift from creating a mild allergen to creating a lethal weapon. What possible motivation could he have had beyond simple revenge?" It was at this point that Miss Marple's detailed investigation into Dr. Summers's personal background and history produced a crucial revelation. Dr. Summers had, several years prior to the dog show, experienced a serious professional and personal crisis. He had worked in pharmaceutical development for a major corporation, and he had become increasingly concerned about the safety protocols related to certain insecticides being developed for agricultural use. Dr. Summers had attempted to raise these safety concerns through proper corporate channels, but his objections had been dismissed by senior management, who were focused primarily on bringing the product to market. In frustration, Dr. Summers had leaked information regarding the safety defects to regulatory authorities and to the media. His actions had resulted in a temporary halt to the product's development and in a significant financial loss for the corporation. However, Dr. Summers had also found himself blacklisted within the pharmaceutical industry, dismissed from his position, and essentially exiled from professional work in his field. His subsequent career had been characterized by diminished status, reduced income, and considerable personal anguish regarding his lost professional standing. It was during this period of professional humiliation and financial hardship that Dr. Summers had encountered Mrs. Ashford. Through a connection at the pharmaceutical company where Ms. Holloway had worked, Dr. Summers had learned of Mrs. Ashford's systematic fraud and her apparent success at avoiding any serious professional consequences, despite having defrauded dozens of individuals of substantial sums of money. This discovery had apparently triggered profound feelings of injustice in Dr. Summers. Here was someone, he seemed to have reasoned, who had committed fraud on a vast scale and had faced no consequences, while he himself had been destroyed for attempting to expose safety defects in corporate products. The notion that he might create a substance to eliminate Mrs. Ashford, and thereby create some measure of justice, appeared to have evolved gradually from theoretical consideration into actual planning and implementation. When confronted with this analysis, Dr. Summers maintained his denials, though his resistance seemed to be crumbling. The substance, he insisted, was never intended to be lethal. The fact that it proved to be lethal was a tragic accident resulting from the particular vulnerability of the individual exposed to it. However, Dr. Summers could not adequately explain how he had obtained detailed information regarding Mrs. Ashford's specific insecticide allergy, nor could he satisfactorily account for the precision of his chemical formulation. His claims that the compound had been designed as a mild allergen stood in stark contradiction to the evidence that it had been created with such exactitude that it produced fatal anaphylaxis in an individual with Mrs. Ashford's particular vulnerability. Chapter 10. The Killer Revealed in Autumn Light. The final pieces of the puzzle assembled themselves on a grey October afternoon, as Miss Marple sat in Inspector Graham's office and explained the conclusions that she had reached regarding the true sequence of events and the respective culpability of the various parties involved. The situation was considerably more complex than a simple conspiracy between Patricia Holloway and Dr. Richard Summers to administer a mild allergen to Mrs. Ashford's show dog. Rather, it involved multiple layers of deception and intention, with each participant believing that they were engaged in a different enterprise than the one in which they were actually involved. Patricia Holloway, Miss Marple began, was motivated by genuine grievance regarding her financial loss and her emotional devastation at having been defrauded. She sought to create a scandal that would expose Mrs. Ashford's fraudulent practices and thereby serve the interests of justice. She approached Dr. Summers with what she genuinely believed to be a request for a mild allergen compound, something that would create embarrassment and prompt investigation, but would not seriously harm Mrs. Ashford. However, Dr. Summers had a considerably different agenda. His previous experience with corporate malfeasance and his own professional destruction had created within him a profound sense of injustice and a desire for revenge. When approached by Ms. Holloway with her request for a substance to embarrass Mrs. Ashford, Dr. Summers recognized the opportunity to eliminate someone whom he perceived as exemplifying the kind of systematic wrongdoing that had gone unpunished in his own experience. Dr. Summers therefore deliberately misrepresented the nature of the compound he was creating. He informed Ms. Holloway that he had formulated a mild allergen based on common substances that might cause temporary discomfort. In reality, he had created a compound specifically designed to deliver Mrs. Ashford's own insecticide allergy in a lethal dosage through skin absorption. To achieve this, Dr. Summers had obtained detailed information regarding Mrs. Ashford's medical history, her known allergies, and her specific vulnerabilities. He had then calculated the precise dosage required to produce fatal anaphylaxis in an individual of Mrs. Ashford's physical characteristics and medical condition. The substance he had created was therefore not an accident or a tragic miscalculation, but rather a calculated murder weapon. Rachel Stevens, Mrs. Ashford's handler, played a more limited but still significant role in the conspiracy. Dr. Summers had approached Rachel with what amounted to extortion. He had informed her of Mrs. Ashford's fraudulent practices and her systematic deception of puppy buyers. He had then suggested that Rachel might assist in exposing these frauds by applying the allergen compound to Mrs. Ashford's show dog at the critical moment when Mrs. Ashford would be certain to handle it directly. Rachel, troubled by what she had learned regarding Mrs. Ashford's practices, and perhaps resentful of her employer's behaviour, had agreed to assist. She had applied the substance to the dog's coat on the morning of the show, believing that she was participating in an action designed to expose fraud rather than to commit murder. Dr. Hartley, the veterinarian who had been the object of suspicion throughout much of the investigation, was entirely innocent of Mrs. Ashford's death. His anger regarding her fraudulent practices was genuine, and his public confrontation with her at the show had been motivated solely by his professional concern for animal welfare and his desire to expose her systematic deceptions. The fact that his visible anger had appeared to provide strong motive for the crime had been entirely coincidental and had served to misdirect the investigation. Inspector Graham listened to this explanation with evident frustration. His investigation had been proceeding in the direction of assuming Dr. Hartley's culpability or Patricia Holloway's direct involvement. The revelation that Dr. Summers had deliberately murdered Mrs. Ashford, while Ms. Holloway had innocently believed she was participating in a conspiracy to cause embarrassment rather than death, created considerable legal complexity. Miss Marple gently suggested that the evidence would likely support charges of murder against Dr. Summers, assault or conspiracy charges against Patricia Holloway, and potentially charges against Rachel Stevens, depending on how the courts interpreted her role in the application of the lethal substance. However, the inspector noted with evident frustration, such charges could be pursued only if he could convince a court that Dr. Summers had deliberately created a lethal compound while misrepresenting his actions to his co-conspirators. It was therefore with considerable satisfaction that Miss Marple presented the final piece of evidence that would prove sufficient to establish Dr. Summers's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Among Dr. Summers's personal papers, carefully hidden and discovered only after a thorough search of his residence, were detailed calculations regarding Mrs. Ashford's allergic vulnerabilities and precise formulations for compounds designed to produce fatal anaphylaxis in an individual with her particular medical history. These documents clearly demonstrated that Dr. Summers had been engaged in deliberate murder rather than the creation of a simple allergen. They revealed his research into Mrs. Ashford's background, his calculations regarding lethal dosages, and his planning regarding the precise moment at which the substance would be applied to ensure that Mrs. Ashford would be exposed to it under circumstances that would trigger the fatal reaction. The evidence was sufficient to convince Inspector Graham to proceed with charges of murder against Dr. Richard Summers. Ms. Holloway and Rachel Stevens, while certainly culpable for their respective roles in the conspiracy, could be charged with lesser offences reflecting their apparent lack of knowledge that they were assisting in a murder rather than in a conspiracy to expose fraud. As Miss Marple prepared to depart from the inspector's office, having essentially completed her unofficial investigation into the circumstances of Mrs. Ashford's death, she reflected on the sad conclusion of the case. A woman who had engaged in systematic fraud and had defrauded dozens of individuals of substantial sums of money had ultimately been destroyed not through legal proceedings or professional consequences, but through murder. Those who had sought to expose her fraud had become, through the deceptions of a man consumed by his own sense of injustice, unwitting participants in a crime far more serious than the one they had originally sought to address. Miss Bantry, who had waited throughout the investigation with characteristic patience and loyalty, greeted Miss Marple's emergence from the police station with evident relief. "I'm glad that business is concluded," Dolly said gently, as they made their way toward her motor car. "These matters are so very exhausting, aren't they, Jane?" "Indeed they are," Miss Marple replied, settling herself into the passenger seat as autumn leaves drifted across the road before them. "Though I confess that I have always found them to be instructive regarding the darker aspects of human nature. People seem to believe that deception and wrongdoing can proceed indefinitely without consequence, yet consequence, in whatever form it ultimately takes, seems inevitably to arrive." The motor car wound its way back towards St. Mary Mead, the peaceful village that was Miss Marple's home, and which, despite her considerable experience with crime and human wickedness, she had always found to be a place of relative safety and order. The dog show had been concluded, Mrs. Ashford had been buried, and the various participants in the conspiracy had been brought before the law to face the consequences of their actions. Justice, in its imperfect but ultimately necessary form, had been served, though Miss Marple reflected that true justice would perhaps have been better served had the frauds and deceptions that had given rise to the murder never been permitted to flourish in the first place.